Welcome everybody, and at the outset I'd like to acknowledge the presence here today of President Higgins's aide-de-camp Stephen Howard. You're very welcome. We gather here today in love and friendship to honour and say farewell to Niall McCullough, one of, as you all know, one of the most brilliant, erudite, elegant and lovable of people. How privileged we have been, how privileged we are to have him amongst us, to share some of this journey of life in the particular light and warmth of his presence. At his wake last night, friends reminded me of many things, and one really simple, clear, true concept has stayed with me in particular. That of Niall as a life force, which of course he was, moral, civic, social and intellectual. He was all that. He was extraordinary. I'm not sure I've ever known anyone with his remarkable mix of clarity, rigour, charm, ease and passion. And mischief, that relishing of life, that marvellous twinkle in his eye, the profound hospitality, open door, open heart, talk, laughter, and interrogation of ideas. Niall helped us see the shape of things. He made things happen. He saw what could be there, what could be placed into life, pulled things out of the shadows into the now. Who else would insist on planting a small shrub at the side of an iconic new building in Trinity College, Dublin, as a constant reminder for those with eyes to see of the hedge school in our history? He made the invisible visible. He mapped Dublin City and its complex architectural history and insisted on truth and integrity in all the work he undertook. He had a rare imagination. One friend in grief said to me, he should have lived to be 110. But he did, I said, he did live, because the moment becomes eternal. The life well lived and the life's work becomes part of time, becomes immortal. Niall's work through and across time, with Valerie, with his colleagues in architecture, his singular, precise, expansive vision enriches us all life, and is immortal. Today, here we say words, we see images, we remember and celebrate a life and spirit mediated in a myriad of experiences. The intangible force within the power, the light, the passion, that sweetest smile are held here and will be held and treasured by all of us for as long as we all have breath. And so it goes. Niall loved art. He made art in all that he did. He loved music. Today we have the heavenly music of Bach, played by Cleon O'Ryan. We'll hear words, memories, apt readings from Dennis Luby, Ruth O'Hurley, Conor Skehan, Niall's niece, the young architect Isolde McCullough. James Conway will read from Niall's forthcoming book on Dublin, and Valerie will talk a little about her life and work with Niall. I should say I won't be jumping up and down to introduce people, so please come and speak or read in the order listed in the very elegant booklet. But let us begin with the young Niall. Well, he was always young and youthful at heart, but in the heart of his family. I welcome Niall's sister, Elizabeth McCullough.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vincent. Well, we were a family of 6, as you all know, mother and father, Nuala and Joe, 3 brothers, Niall, Owen and Conor, and 1 sister, that was me, and we've always been very close. Niall was the firstborn, and he had a special place in our parents' hearts. He was affectionate, intelligent, creative, full of ideas, and always interesting. He had a passion for learning, enormous charm, and a wicked sense of humour. From the very start, Niall was a non-conformist. Rather than trying to fit into the mould, he enjoyed being different. As a child, his bedroom was a shrine to his latest passion. When other young boys were outside playing tag, Niall was reading about the Napoleonic Wars, with the French and Prussian armies laid out in battle formation on the floor, each and every lead soldier carefully hand-painted in exquisite detail. Niall received his formal education in Gonzaga College, where he was an excellent and somewhat unique student. His early interest in history and architecture was again displayed in his textbooks, which were handed down to Owen and Connor. These were never annotated with helpful notes, but rather festooned with sketches of imaginary houses. The boys found these fascinating and even beautiful, but useless for cogging for exams. We lived in Cowper Road until 1973, where, probably in a sign of the times, the main childhood game was Checkpoint Charlie, a sophisticated communist border guard game, which involved tricycling around the garden. One of the boys played the person trying to escape from East Berlin, the other played the guard who checked the papers. But Niall always played the Stasi senior interrogator, who would shout terrifyingly at the other two, and even, on occasion, beat them up a bit. Niall was a maverick, and he certainly caused some heartache to our parents as teenagers. Although sometimes they could get annoyed with him, they could never really be angry. He just turned on the charm and managed to make whatever he had done seem either perfectly rational, wildly amusing, or both. In his later years, Niall's bedroom became a laboratory for alternative design. When our parents went away on a brief holiday, he took the opportunity to rip up the carpets, take down the curtains, and scrape the wallpaper off the walls. This was, after all, the 1970s. As a brother, Niall was engaging, affectionate, and funny. He had the privilege and the burden of being the firstborn to blaze the trail for us, his younger siblings. He was keenly interested in each of us, our interests, our ambitions, and he was generally very supportive, except when it came to our sports endeavours. If there's one thing that Niall was not interested in, it was sport, and he had very little respect for anyone who thought that sport was in any way worthwhile. Connor remembers one occasion when he was about 12. He had just won a tennis tournament, and Mom and Dad were congratulating him. Niall followed him out of the room. Connor thought his big brother was finally about to acknowledge his achievements, but instead Niall whispered in his ear, "They're only encouraging you because they think you're so stupid." And then he disappeared. But other than sports, we shared many, many interests. History, art. He had a passion for music, shared with myself. From early childhood on, family dinners played a big part in our lives, and we looked forward to sparring with Niall at these. He was discursive by nature, with a unique perspective on life, amusing and witty, with a perfectly developed sense of the absurd. For some reason, Niall never wanted to fill his own wine glass. He would always, with a discreet wink or a nod, encourage one of us to pour, inevitably followed by a concerned suggestion to others around the table that perhaps we were drinking too much. Generally, we treated Niall with less reverence at home than he might have become used to in the professional world. We even joked that people would only ever buy his books as doorstoppers, but definitely not to read them. But at the same time, we've always been massively proud of his achievements. From the first architectural award he won while still at school for a building on Eustace Street, to his later books, lectures, exhibitions, and of course his wonderful buildings with Valerie. Niall was a devoted and caring son, spending a lot of time with our parents, going on numerous outings and holidays with them in Ireland and overseas. He was always very attentive to Nuala, our mother, and always on the lookout for things that would interest her. For example, collecting fascinating information about her father's war record. And even over the past few months, when he was ill, he took delight in FaceTiming her regularly. Niall had a particularly close bond with Joe, our father, sharing a passion for history, the built and the natural environment, and conservation. We all recall family holidays spent trudging endlessly around national monuments, from ruined abbey to city walls to modern building, right across the country. It took ages to drive anywhere, with the pair of them stopping en route for every pile of stones by the side of the road. Our wonderful memories are too numerous to outline here today in 5 minutes, so I'll conclude simply by saying that Niall played an enormous and enriching part in all our lives, as a son and as a brother, and we will miss him immensely. Thank you.
And this is what we mean by friends. Even when they are absent, they are with us. Even when they lack some things, they have an abundance of others. Even when they are weak, they are strong. And, harder still to say, even when they are dead, they are alive.
At the end of the Second War, in a world inured to widespread destruction, the city of Dublin stood poor, materially exhausted, but substantially intact. That particular quality of that city is hard to recapture today. Its aspect lay in its scale, its fragile integrity, in the worn materiality of acres of old brick houses sheltering vivid social exchange. Between the end of the war and the start of the 20th century, this city was substantially destroyed. It is not that everything was taken away. What was lost was the density and legibility of the city, its statement, its singular nature. Such considerations have useful depth without recourse to nostalgic reverie. The 21st century lacks retrospective imagination, and even images taken of things which have vanished, a street, a room looking onto a garden, offer some access to history and to alternative realities of place. Freedom from any requirement to absorb the past is absolute. But it is also true that the submerged patterns of old cities provide a potential richness of alternative experience, something open-ended and outward-looking, which is relevant and absolutely of the present. Their maze-like natures challenge the strictures of contemporary life. They also electrify experience. In a globalized world condemned to the endless repetition of ideas, they are innately original. Finding ways to make contemporary lives within their framework offers further capacity for new thinking. When context is dislocated, meaning is dislodged. Sometimes, as in Dublin, the rupture is so huge that it creates a caesura, a loss of memory and a diminution of possibility with subtle and profound implications. Today, there is only a glancing relationship between contemporary life and history. The wild, unknown past, parsed and reparsed, but impossible to ignore, is no longer life's companion. Dublin is alienated from its origins. Its self-image lies in a cult of ordinariness without singular obsession. In some ways, it portrays a remarkable flexibility of image, capable of being remolded in response to different criteria. Its other history is off-limits, folded away. Some of the reasons for this are generic, others local, complex, about disputed histories and altered cultures. The same is true of its architectural nature. People have little idea of what they have lost, so little understanding of what they might have enjoyed and built on. Perhaps, because of its peculiar history, Dublin can only be caught in a composite view rather than through a straightforward narrative. This collection of parts is about its physical form, but can include the grand geography of sensual things around it that are ordinary, but by no means prosaic. The moody climate, dampness, the undulating floodplain of culverted tributaries like a hand skeleton, the interrelationship of river, bay, and city, one tidal, subject to rhythmic change, but unchanging, the other a rickety man-made fragility upstream. Everything to do with water. Quays, docks, constant dredging, levels rising and falling, the raw empty bed at low tide. Specificity combines nature and humanity. Archaeology is everywhere underfoot, the natural landscape adjusted by layers of human detritus. Light falls in particular ways on worn materials. The latitude brings low afternoon sun, especially in winter, with light reflected on window glass. The quality of the 18th century city is cumulative, in the formerly overwhelming unity of expression, but also in a kind of floating greatness between its original manifestation and the different versions of modernity that came to play on it due to its long and static survival. Describing its trajectory becomes less like architectural history, more art or opera. Its elusive originality of place is composed of the city that was made, then the unintended way in which it was used, then how it was destroyed. Creation, occupation, and destruction.
My way is in the sand flowing between the shingle and the dune. The summer rain rains on my life, on me, my life harrying, fleeing to its beginning, to its end. My peace is there in the receding mist, when I may cease from treading these long, shifting thresholds and live in the space of a door that opens and shuts.
I knew for sure that I wanted to be an architect when I was 16 and spent a week working with Niall and Valerie at their office on Setanta Place. I built a model of the threshold between a recording studio and an existing house. The client, a musician, cared less for the architecture of the space than for its function, its silence. I remember so well how delighted Niall was by this peculiarity, a battle to extract beauty from a brief that disregarded it. From the very beginning, his passion and energy has inspired me. Throughout college, he was a constant support. It took me a while to realise how much he was there. He was so willing to be involved and to help. He wanted to know. But he was also conscious to afford me the space to do it on my own. He was such an independent thinker. He did things his own way. I think he wanted to give me the opportunity to do the same. Our relationship grew with my enthusiasm. I remember countless conversations in the front room of House and Leeson Park and in cafes around Molesworth Street. No matter what we spoke about, I would leave those interactions entirely energised, ready to see, draw, or make. Niall had the vision and the language to be able to do that. As a student, I remember how important Niall's writings were to us all. I took such delight in noticing someone reading his book in Richview Library, or seeing his words referenced on screen during a lecture. Messages from friends in recent days have stressed the continued and lasting influence of these works. For the last 6 months, I have had the opportunity to work alongside him. Every day he made me proud. He was ambitious, bold, and never completely satisfied. He was curious and constantly questioned what he saw in front of him. He believed in pushing an idea as far as it could go, to see what happened at the edge. I think his buildings reflect that. At McCullough Mulvin, every design, whether it's a single room or a university wing, is treated as something special. As a teacher and guide, he was generous with his knowledge, but he was also eager to listen and to hear. I do think he really believed that ideas could and would come from anyone. In the office, he trusted us. I haven't worked at McCullough Mulvin for long, but it's very difficult to imagine it without him. He was also an uncle and a friend. He nurtured specific relationships with each of his nieces and nephews, both McCulloughs and Mulvins. He made a point of appreciating our differences. He really did care. He read stories and dissertations. He escorted godchildren on birthday shopping trips. He wrapped Christmas presents in newspaper. He took us for lunches that were feasts. And he sent cryptic text messages that hid beautiful recommendations for cities and towns across Europe. Niall has been my mentor and role model for so long. I would use the word idol if I didn't think he'd hate it. Working alongside him for the past few months has really been the honour of my life, and I just feel so lucky to have had the opportunity to do so. As is true for many of us, I love him very much, and I will miss him.
Clarice. In its centuries of decadence, emptied by plagues, its height reduced by collapsing beams and cornices and by the shifts of terrain, rusted and stopped up through neglect and the lack of maintenance men, the city slowly became populated again as the survivors emerged from the basements and lairs in hordes, swarming like rats, driven by their fury to rummage and gnaw, and yet also to collect and patch like nesting birds. They grabbed everything that could be taken from where it was and put it in another place to serve a different use. Brocade curtains ended up as sheets. In marble funerary urns they planted basil. Wrought iron gratings torn from the harem windows were used for roasting cat meat on fires of inlaid wood. Put together with the odd bits of the useless Clarice, a survivor's Clarice was taking shape. All huts and hovels, festering sewers and rabbit cages. And yet, almost nothing was lost of Clarice's former splendour. It was all there, merely arranged in different order, no less appropriate to the inhabitants' needs than it had been before. The days of poverty were followed by more joyous times. A sumptuous butterfly Clarence emerged, and from the beggared chrysalis Clarice. The new abundance made the city overflow with new materials, buildings, objects. New people flocked in from outside. No one had any connection with the former Clarice or Clarices. And the more the new city settled triumphantly into the place and into the name of the first Clarice, the more it realised it was moving away from it, destroying it no less rapidly than the rats and the mould.
What to say about Niall, my beautiful companion? Brilliant, sparkling, attentive, fierce, restless, intelligent, fearless, original. We met in the second year studio in the School of Architecture in Earlsford Terrace, where I first noticed his beautiful hands drawing. Long fingers, fine-boned, beautiful skin. A way of drawing and holding a pencil which never changed. Startling blue eyes, a mischievous smile. Mutual attraction consolidated on a class trip to Paris. Our eyes opened wide to the excitement of seeing Le Corbusier's work in the flesh for the first time in the context of the city. We got student summer jobs together in Europe, working in a German factory so we could travel to Finland to study Alvar Aalto's work firsthand. We lived in a wet tent and ate salami. We got scholarships and we drove to Rome with Nat and our few possessions. We immersed ourselves in architectural culture and began to understand what it was for a city to have that. We found a modern architecture gallery near the Ripetta, who made exhibitions of their mainly unbuilt work. We went to their openings, discovered a way of communicating architectural culture through exhibitions and drawings in the absence of real projects. Both passionate about classical antiquity, we began to study the city of Rome through the lens of the Nolli map, delving down to Roman archaeological layers, looking at the changes wrought by Renaissance and Baroque popes, learning the sediment of the city. Drawing, observing, taking nothing for granted, and knowing not too much. No better place to immerse oneself in palimpsest of the city. So we laid out a pattern, working by analysis, drawing as a tool of investigation to understand the layers beneath our feet. When our year in Rome was up, there was no work for architects. We came home via Milan, where we met Aldo Rossi, incredibly inspirational man for our generation. He took the architecture of the historic city, undressed it for now, understanding its forms and topologies, taking its weight and density back into the usable canon of architecture. Rossi made no line between what was new and what was old. It was a quarry of usable things which had to be understood before you could intervene. He had no jobs, but it was the morning after Italy had won the World Cup, and he was generous with his time. He showed us a book his students had done on vernacular architecture in Ticino, typologically organising it so its essence could be understood. We thought that was something we might try and do for Ireland. So when we got back to Dublin, where there was absolutely no work for architects either, we set about working on a book together, A Lost Tradition, recording and surveying buildings from earliest times to the early 20th century, not for history, but for their typological connection, excavating a tradition of building in Ireland which up to then people denied existed. Niall was always conscious of history as a source to be used and reinvented to describe a new truth. Not in a pedantic way either. Of course it was he who photographed our battered blue Renault 4 in front of Timoleague Abbey at the same angle exactly as Maurice Craig's famous photograph of his elegant Delage from 40 years previously. We set up the Ann Street Press in 1988 so we could control what we said, be able to write without heed. Publishing our research became a lifelong strand of work. Dublin was a blank canvas in those days, vacant sites, car parks everywhere. There were no apartments except for Dublin Corporation flats. Hardly anyone lived in the city. It's almost impossible for young people now to understand that context. As well as working on the book, we set about meeting with like-minded architects recently returned to Dublin from Europe to implement what we'd seen in that architecture gallery in Rome, communicating through drawings and exhibitions. And with these colleagues, who later became our Blue Studio and Group 91 allies, we worked on what we called counter-projects, inventing work, taking areas of the empty city and making proposals for them. But Niall always liked to have more than one project on the go at any one time. He began to research Dublin in a way that was forensic and original, walking the streets, deriving empirical results based on what he could see with his own eyes, not what anybody told him. A gaze which unravelled how the city had been developed, using old maps, plans, and his fierce intelligence. Published as Dublin and Urban History in 1989, it changed the way people thought about the city. And he followed that with Palimpsest, his book on layering, change, and buildings in Ireland. Another book is planned, which you've just heard an extract from, which I have to finish for him. Teaching allowed us to start our practice around 1986, independent of everyone, empires of ourselves. We created a world. Looking back, we were setting up unfettered structures which would serve us well. We were both slightly awkward people who didn't take direction well. Making independent structures for life was a way to keep a clear view and not be beholden to anyone. Anybody who's been in our hallway in Leeson Park will have seen it's lined with maps. They describe his exploring spirit, uncharted territory. Mediterranean coastal charts are opposite the Nolli map of Rome and the Roke's map of Dublin. Maps and travelling developed his incredible sense of place. Our generation, as Lizzie said, was obsessed with the Cold War as a physical presence in Europe, which created a sense of other. We spent a lot of time exploring the frozen in time beautiful urban spaces of Eastern Europe on trips in the 90s once the wall came down. And that was balanced by Roman and Greek sites all around the Mediterranean for 20 years. And it made us familiar with a geography and a history that Braudel would have been pleased with. Niall loved very early things and very modern things, often illuminated by the same spirit of spareness and essentiality. All our holidays were bent to include locations of interest, new buildings and old sites, and we did more than our share of passionate, directed travelling, constantly learning. He adored European film. We used Antonioni stills in our Venice Biennale piece of 2008, and he first started making films about our work in 2015. The films were about elements against architecture, rain dripping on lead, water wearing away stone. For a film projected onto the sloping ceiling of the Sao Bento metro station in Porto, he had drone footage flying over our project in India, looking down on the buildings but projected upwards on the ceiling, and he loved the double reading that gave. His work as an architect was central to his existence. Any brief, that intelligent gaze, worked out in biro, pencil, crayon, pen, never precious. His method of work tended to carving out from a solid, very monumental, constantly coming back to the idea. What's the idea, he'd say, and what's interesting about that? He's made a slew of buildings with remarkable space, volume and materiality. I'm sorry he won't see the Printing House Square project at the edge of Trinity completed, although he was thrilled to see the scaffolding coming down, particularly off the roof, which he designed as a mountain range. Finally, as you'll all know, he had the most remarkable gift for friendship, probably best captured in our long table lunches, his invention for Dublin summer life. These became an annual event, bringing people together for food, laughter, conversation. And when he became ill, he forged a real friendship with Prof. Lowry and Prof. Reynolds, his oncological and surgical consultants at St. James's Hospital, who gave him their absolute best, for which we thank them and their teams most sincerely. While he honed himself to be an attentive, intelligent listener, his huge ambition in life was to avoid being bored. And as a result, he kept up an excoriating and exceedingly funny email exchange with many friends. His text messages were famous, as Aesop has said, for their brevity, and he spent time reducing them to utter essentials, often to the edge of intelligibility. He was alive to the irony and the absurdity of everything, and now the absurdity of his leaving us far too soon. Niall, my constant, my life's companion, you're with me always. Thank you.
The day is calm, the room serene, a blackbird sings beyond the sun. Valerie mentioned there Niall's beautiful long hands. They are now immortalised, entwined forever with Valerie's in beautiful bronze by their friend Dorothy Cross, and I might say pointing eternally upwards. Niall, as we heard in that extract from the book to come, loved the right words in the right order. Louis MacNeice's Dublin, for me, speaks to Niall's love of this city and its history. Grey brick upon brick, declamatory bronze on sombre pedestals, O'Connell, Grattan Moor, and the brewery tugs and the swans on the balustraded streams, and the bare bones of the fanlight over a hungry door. There's a kind of flinty granite strength in MacNeice, a power of light and shadow and darkness that is right. From Autumn Journal: sleep, my body, sleep, my ghost, sleep, my parents and grandparents, and all those I have loved most. Sleep to the noise of running water, tomorrow to be crossed. However deep, there is sunlight, there will be sunlight later. Niall is off on a journey into the light and the water, returning to the source in Ostia, the old port in Rome. He asked that his ashes be scattered there. He loved the eternal city. Before he heads off for Italy, we'll see Niall in an extract from the Open House film Site Specific from last year. And after that, before we all leave, there will be another beautiful Bach piece. But could I suggest that we import a tradition from the theatre, which Niall did love, and give him one great rousing round of applause. I'm sure he'd give us that kind of quizzical look, but I imagine he might be secretly chuffed. So, Niall in a film.
if you stand back, Dublin's most interesting point, that at the centre of it, there's a university. And that's a very unusual thing in any city. It's not a palace or it's not a park. It's a seat of learning. And that's totally conscious. It was totally conscious in the ideas of the people who built and laid out the city. At the centre, there'd be something that represented civilization and improvement. And Trinity is a grid of buildings surrounded by green, surrounded by a wall, which is surrounded by all this mass of streets which are bent and folded over in different shapes and lines. And all these bent streets and different buildings, they look in at this extraordinary rational grid in the middle of a green space, which is their ideal. That's unique. There's nothing else like that. We've been lucky enough to work in Trinity playing with that grid and in making buildings which deal with the edge of Trinity. We've made gateways, and at the moment we're making one in Printing House Square off Pearse Street. It takes up a courtyard form. It sits behind the old printing house, the 18th century printing house. And so we formed the roof almost like a kind of a mountain range, or like a snapshot of a series of Georgian roofs with all those kind of serried ranks. But essentially it was as kind of a folding form, like a Baroque form, like an animal coiled around the courtyard that folded over and down and came down behind the printing house. There is an enormously increased interest in architecture, generally in the population. What's definitely true for young architects is the lack of opportunity through lack of competition. That's for sure. That's there. And there's way too much emphasis on the particularity of experience having to lead on to other experience. That's not the way architects are trained. You're trained to think of an issue and a brief and come up with a solution. And the fresher you are, probably the better the solution. Architecture is political. Young architects are given a great opportunity, I think, by their education and training to contribute ideas. There are 100 interesting ways that I've seen around the world that architects can make huge social impact with small ideas that are design-based, but are also socially based, but that come out of the architectural mind.
Thank you.